Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. The show is brought to you by the International Affairs Forum of Traverse City and comes to you from the studios of Up North Media. Karen Puschel is the producer. I'm your host, Jack Segal. Our topic today is the Middle East. In December 2010, a series of demonstrations and protests began in Tunisia and swept across the entire region. The frustrations and aspirations of young people spilled onto the streets to confront long-entrenched dictators and monarchs. In just over a year, 4 rulers had been swept from power, but the promise of democracy and reform was not to be realized, at least not yet. To explain what happened in those tumultuous days, what has transpired since then, and the surprisingly hopeful prospects that those events signal for the region's future, is one of America's leading experts on the subject. Juan Cole is professor of history at the University of Michigan. He's the author of numerous books and articles, including Engaging the Muslim World, and his latest highly acclaimed work, The New Arabs, How the Millennial Generation is Changing the Middle East. He delighted a full house of International Affairs Forum fans on April 16th at the Millikan Auditorium of Northwestern Michigan College. Professor Cole earned a master's degree in Arabic Studies and History at the American University in Cairo and his PhD in Islamic Studies from UCLA. He speaks Arabic, Persian Farsi, and Urdu fluently. Juan Cole, welcome to Beyond the Headlines.
Thank you, Jack.
It's great to have you here. Now, people know a little bit maybe about the Arab Spring. They vaguely recall the demonstrations that were sweeping the region, particularly starting in Tunisia and going on to Egypt, and then it seemed to go all over the region. But since then, it looks like we've kind of taken some steps backward. How would you assess the outcome, or is this really the outcome, or are we simply in the middle of a process?
Oh, very much in the middle of a process. I mean, we're 4 years in to a set of popular revolutions which overthrew 4 presidents for life and deeply challenged a 5th, and provoked constitutional and other changes in a number of other countries where there was less turmoil, but still some. So, I think we forget that revolutions are messy. They're long-lasting. If you think about the French Revolution, 4 years in, they had just cut off the head of the king, and provincial revolts were beginning, and they had the Great Terror and all of those beheadings. And so, yes, they got the rights of man out of it, and some progressive measures and more of a separation of religion and state, but it wasn't smooth sailing by any means. And I think likewise in the Middle East, in some countries, as in Tunisia, where people are fairly well off economically, where they're well educated, the transition has been smooth there. In others, you had 40 years of dictatorship, secret police. People in those societies never managed anything for themselves. They don't know how to conduct affairs as a democracy. And so there's a steep learning curve. There's a tendency for factionalism and score settling and so forth. So it's going to take a long time for all of this to shake out. But I think we shouldn't forget the achievements, which is that the days of presidents for life in the region are probably over with.
Well, that is quite an accomplishment, and when you mentioned that this process really kind of came out of nowhere almost, but I imagine there was a lot of unrest bubbling just below the surface with all these dictators and presidents for life, as they like to call themselves. I recall a map that was published under the title Youthquake. And it showed that in the United States, I think 40% of the population is under the age of 30. And in some of the countries in the Middle East, the numbers were like 60 or 65%. That's a startling difference. And is that a major factor in the unrest that exists in those countries?
Well, I don't think that you can read off anything from a large youth bulge. There are some social scientists who have made that argument, but I'd just like to point out that there's been a large youth bulge in every generation in the Middle East since the 1870s. The population growth rate has been tremendous. You know, Egypt's population in 1850, we think, was 5 million.
5 million.
And today it's 85 million.
That's stunning.
It's incredible. Whereas France's population in 1850 was roughly 30 million, and today it's 62 million. So France has doubled, but Egypt is, you know, many times bigger. So there's at any point along the line, you could have said, well, Egypt has this huge youth bulge, and some generations have been quiet in Egypt. So I don't think the existence of so many youth in and of itself is what's driving these issues. The question is, do the youth organize around being youth? Do they have aspirations as a generation? Do they make organizations and demands on that basis? And in this generation, it's exactly what they did. And so, you know, even today, Egyptian politicians talk about, well, we have to consult the youth. And I'm going to tell you, nobody ever thought about consulting the youth before. I mean, this in politics in Egypt, it was a patriarchal society. The youth were supposed to do what the old men said.
And still in many families, it's still that way, probably. Well, that suggests that the youth are onto something. There was a lot of buzz about how they use social media to organize and stay one step ahead of the authorities, and they made a big deal out of that at the time of Tahrir Square and other major demonstrations. Was that reality? Was it that important?
Well, I think the social media had a place, but it was exaggerated with regard to its importance. The youth told me that neighborhood organizing was the key. They would actually walk districts. They would go door to door. They would pamphleteer. They would chant in the streets or from balconies.
And those crowded little alleys that are full of people. Yes.
Yeah, you would hear.
You in Cairo.
Yeah,
yes.
There's a good megaphone there in densely populated urban areas. So in some ways, you know, they succeeded in much the same way as, say, the youthful Obama supporters did here in this country in 2008. Through political organizing and as I said, walking neighborhoods can't be underestimated. So I think Zeynep Tufekci and a colleague, a social scientist here in the United States, did exit polling at Tahrir Square of people who had been there and how they found out about it, and they found about a quarter of the respondents said that they had heard about it through social media. But the vast majority of them, it was either face-to-face invitations or telephone calls.
So old-fashioned telephone calls, imagine.
Old cell phones, but in any case, I think we underestimate those just networking as revolution making.
Now, in Egypt in particular, I recall from my own experience in the former Soviet Union that the absence of a political system, a political party system, was a tremendous factor in the disarray of so-called democracy that's emerged since then. And I remember in the Egyptian election, there were a huge number of parties that won seats, but that the young people didn't do very well, and then all of a sudden you had the Muslim Brotherhood, the best organized, emerging as the top party. What went wrong there? What should we have been looking for in that? Are we overly in love with elections?
Well, no. I think what the young people wanted was elections, but once you went to elections, the young people got sidelined because they're too young to run for office. And, I mean, there are no 22-year-old parties, no parties for 22-year-olds. So I think once it went to elections, it was the old politicians who had experience in running an election that did well. And in a place like Egypt, you know, there really was an overwhelming dominance of the country by one party. It wasn't a one-party state. There were a few other recognized parties, but they were small. They weren't allowed to have very many seats, and they didn't have much reach. But the junior partner of the regime, ironically enough, was the Muslim Brotherhood, the religious right opposition, was allowed to blow off steam. And there were, roughly 450 members of the lower house of the Egyptian parliament. In 2000, in the middle of the last decade, they got 88 seats. So they were a significant, as I said, junior partner of the regime, at the same time as that the regime tried to disadvantage them and marginalize them. But if you can get 88 seats in the middle of the last decade under the Mubarak dictatorship, you know how to run an election.
Right.
And so when things opened up, they ran circles around the other parties who didn't have that kind of experience or breadth in the country. But in Tunisia, the situation was quite different, and it matters a lot what exactly the electoral rules are, how you project out certain kinds of results. And in Tunisia, the Muslim Fundamentalist Party only got 37% of the vote, which turned into 42% of seats in parliament. But then they had to make a coalition with leftist and liberal parties in order to have a government. And then they could never push anything through on their own. They always had to get the assent of the leftists and liberals for the constitution and other measures. And so Tunisia's path, I think, was much smoother, in part because there was no big winner in the aftermath of the revolution.
They were forced into a coalition
They were
with
forced
other
into-
parties.
They were forced to make compromises with each other. And then also the Tunisians had lived through a horrible civil war in Algeria. We didn't hear so much about it in this country in the 90s, between fundamentalists and secularists, and the Tunisians were very determined not to fall into that trap. So they had a kind of life experience that also helped them to compromise, I think. Whereas those events in Algeria were very distant from Egypt and for some reason, and the Egyptians never seemed to be afraid of just pushing it to the ultimate limit and refusing to back down. And so then you had a lot of turmoil because of lack of compromise.
Now, you mentioned that here where fundamentalist parties or let's say highly religious parties have compromised. And we hear all the time now about ISIL, ISIS, the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda. They don't seem to be compromising type people. How fundamental, that's the wrong word, how important is the growth of this organization or whatever it is? It's already a quasi-state of ISIS there in the middle of Syria and Iraq. Is this something that we should be deeply concerned about? Is this going to spread all over the region? Are they going to get a caliphate that covers all the Middle East?
Well, I think that the phenomenon of extremism is concerning, and of course they have already killed lots of people, thousands, and put them in mass graves, and they're good guerrilla fighters. They've honed their skills to some extent fighting the Marines in Iraq. So, after a while you mirror your enemy, so they got to know Marine tactics, and they've deployed those effectively against the Syrian army and the other fundamentalists, ironically enough, and then against the Kurdish forces. So I think they had to be contained. You couldn't just let them run wild and take over things. On the other hand, I think there's been a lot of hype about them, and I think they only flourish in places where the state has collapsed and where the state doesn't have the resources to take them on militarily in a frontal way. We have seen very effective counterattacks. So the Kurdish Peshmerga, the paramilitary of the Kurdistan regional government of northern Iraq, took back Mount Sinjar and saved the Yazidi minority from them, and with U.S. close air support. But once the Kurdish fighters had that, they were able to make progress against the ISIL fighters. So these guys are not 10 feet tall. They can be defeated, and they have lost, according to the Pentagon, something like 25% of the territory that they grasped in the summer of 2014. So I think gradually they'll be pushed back, ground down. They face enormous opposition in the region. Iran doesn't want them there, and Iran has helped the Baghdad government to push them back. Russia doesn't want them there, and Russia has sent weaponry to Baghdad. Even the Chinese are afraid of them because they have their own Muslim minority.
The Uyghurs,
the Uyghurs, and they don't want these ideas spreading there, and so they've offered to help Baghdad. NATO doesn't want them there. David Cameron in the UK and Francois Hollande in France are militant about pushing them back. So you've got the whole world against you, and you're your small band of 20,000 fighters. Those aren't good odds. So I expect them gradually to be pushed back, and I don't think 5 years from now we'll be talking about them.
That's interesting. Now they, I mean, right now they're filling a vacuum because there's a vacuum in Syria, and there's, at least in the Sunni region of Iraq, there's no support or yet for the Baghdad government. So you think that the government in Baghdad can repair that that relationship with their Sunni population eventually?
Well, I think, you know, that the real question is, can they? The Baghdad government is dominated by pretty hardline Shiite fundamentalists, many of whom have close ties with Tehran, and they're viewed as not very friendly by the Sunni minority, Sunni Arab minority in Iraq. And that's why the north and the west of the country made common cause with ISIL, even though, you know, Iraqi Sunnis are the most secular people in the Middle East. Something like 75% of them said in a poll just in 2012 that they thought there should be a separation of religion and state. So it's not like this is not a population that's yearning for a caliphate, but they felt so oppressed by the Baghdad government that they were even willing to make a deal with the devil. I think two things are going to happen. One is that since it's unacceptable to Baghdad that it lose this territory to ISIL, and since Baghdad has all of these allies, the Sunni Arab areas of Iraq are going to be reconquered.
So there's going to be a slugfest going on for years, maybe.
That's right. Like the Syrian, you know, attack on Homs. So I think they're going to have to destroy the city to save it, I fear. So that's one thing that's going to happen. And then once it's been reconquered, which I think it will be, the north and the west of Iraq will be reincorporated under Baghdad rule by force. Then the big question is, can Baghdad do politics with the Sunnis and reach out? You know, Iraq has no national party.
So they're entirely secular. They're
entirely sectarian.
Sectarian, rather.
Yeah, or ethnic. Yeah. So you know, that's not good.
Yeah.
It would be as though there were no Democratic or Republican Party. There was a California Party, and there was a Christian Party, and you know, you couldn't get anybody together across those lines. And in the United States, so this is the situation in Iraq. So I think Iraq only survives as a country if it can develop a party that both Sunnis and Shiites would vote for, and they haven't in the vacuum that was created by the American overthrow of the Iraqi one-party state, which was secular. It was a horrible genocidal party, but it was.
They kept the lid on.
It was a national party. There is no national party, and so unless they develop one, unless the Sunnis feel there's something they can buy into and have influence in, and that the Shiites are willing to trade horses and so forth, then the long-term prospects for Iraq as a country are not good.
And that suggests sort of a weak state, if not a vacuum. And here we have Iran. Or maybe we're overhyping that threat too. We see Iran as a very hostile and aggressive state until quite recently. And you know, I watch what Washington is doing vis-a-vis Tehran, and ask myself, is there a strategy here that we just haven't seen yet? That we're we're embracing, we're getting closer to the Iranian government in the hope of some sort of fundamental change in their attitude.
Yeah. Well, there are several things to say about Iran. First of all, it's not a conventionally aggressive state. Iran hasn't invaded its neighbors with tanks, and it hasn't taken over territory from them. It's not occupying anything. And in fact, it hasn't initiated any wars for a very long time.
The Iran-Iraq War was started by Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, and the Taliban made trouble for the Iranians, but it wasn't that Iran was going into Afghanistan. So from the point of view of conventional military force, they're not an aggressive country, and I think it's difficult for them to be. It's a huge country. It's relatively thinly populated, and so marshaling that country to war is not easy. And the Iranians will defend themselves, but I don't think it's easy to get up an offensive army. They have interfered in their neighbors through covert operations, special operations, and so forth. In a way, they have a Rumsfeld policy, just as we have the Joint Special Forces Operation Command, the JSOC. So the Iranians have the Quds Brigade, or the Jerusalem Brigade of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and that's the one they send into Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, and they help local forces to organize. They give them strategic advice. Maybe there's some logistical help and so forth, but it's a relatively light footprint, and it's typically invited in by the host country. So it's
or the faction that happens because we control this area at the time.
That's right. So I mean, as I said, it's in a funny sort of way, it mirrors contemporary American
special
tactics.
forces. Yeah. Well, going back to the sort of the central Middle East. There's been a lot of discussion about the Iranians and the Saudis as locked in a gigantic struggle of the Sunnis versus the Shia, and the Sunnis represented by the Saudis and the Shia by Iran as the predominantly, almost exclusively Shia country, but although Shia are all over the region. Are we seeing this gigantic cataclysmic confrontation and we're just in the early stages of it, or is this more of CNN, Fox going wild over a new story?
Well, my argument is that if you know the players, this kind of overarching story of Sunni and Shiite conflict doesn't actually make very much sense. So Iran is not supporting the Syrian government because of Shiism. The Syrian government is secular. It's Ba'athist, so it's kind of Stalinism light, and it actually, in the old days, persecuted religion, and and they don't talk about themselves as a religious force. Now, it's true that there is a vaguely Shiite minority in Syria, which is powerful in the government, the Alawites, but those are not considered to be Orthodox Shiites by the Ayatollahs in Tehran, and indeed kind of not considered to be Muslims by people in the region. They don't have mosques, they don't pray 5 times a day, they don't do anything that looks
So they're quite
Muslim.
a fringe element in the Shiism.
Yeah, it's kind of Santa Monica Shiism. I don't think that Iran is sending military help to Syria because they approve of the Alawite sect. It's heterodox. It doesn't make any sense. They're doing that surely for geopolitics, because Syria's government is just not close to the Saudi bloc. And so I think really the distinctions here are not Sunni and Shiite. It's Republicans versus monarchists, and it's pro-Saudi forces versus pro-Iranian sources, pro-Iranian forces. And there's, a Shiite element here and there. Southern Lebanon is 12er Shiite, the same kind of sect that's in Iran. But most of the countries where Iran is accused of interfering, like Yemen or Syria, The local Shiites who have hooked up with Iran aren't even, Orthodox Shiites from an Iranian point of view. So I don't think that that's the main reason that they have that geopolitical projection of force into the region. And should be remembered, the Iranians are always accused of supporting Hamas, which is virulently Sunni fundamentalist. And if you got them alone, they would say they didn't like Shiites, but they're happy to take Iran's money.
Right.
So I don't think that narrative, which comes actually from King Abdullah II in Jordan, of the Shiite crescent and the rise of the Shiite forces in the Middle East, I don't think that's really the right analysis. And I think even King Abdullah has backtracked a little bit. He because of the rise of ISIL and those things, he said, "I never saw the Sunni crescent coming."
The bad Sunnis, yes. Well, this kind of leads to a good way to pull this together would be, well, what's the United States' interest? What's the United States' role in all this? There are lots of Americans who say, oh, the Middle East is hopeless. Let's just stay out of it. Let's not be involved at all. What are our options, really? What would be your recommendations for what we are doing in the region?
Well, personally, I think that the United States needs an overarching policy towards the region, and I think we've gone from a period in the Bush administration in which there was an overarching policy, but that it was way too interventionist and muscular, invading countries and occupying them and overthrowing.
Bring democracy to the Middle East.
Well, the sort of bring democracy or else, and I think that was a mistake. But then I think the Obama administration has overreacted against that kind of muscular Wilsonianism, some people have called it, of the Bush administration, and democracy promotion at the point of a gun, by kind of more or less withdrawing from the region and then dealing with it as crises popped up in an ad hoc sort of manner. And so Obama, for whatever reason, was persuaded by some of his administration officials and by the Europeans to go into Libya. And they gave close air support to the rebels, and they destroyed the Gaddafi regime depots and so forth. And so I think facilitated the revolution there, although it was a popular revolution. But then there was no follow-through. The Obama administration walked away from Libya after that. And then once the Benghazi attacks occurred in 2012, and the Congress made this a constant circus of inquiries and so forth, I was told by American diplomats in North Africa that Tunisia, Libya, they had to go down to a skeleton crew at the embassy. The dependents were all taken out. They said, we can't do our jobs. They said, the U.S. can have no influence in these countries under these circumstances of just a skeleton crew at the embassy. And then we did no training that I know of a new Libyan army, which there was none after the revolution really to speak of. And surely the country needs an army if it's going to stay together. But it just seemed to me that why would you go into a country and help to overthrow its government and then just completely walk away from it and let it fall into chaos? And you could argue that the United States is not all powerful and maybe couldn't have prevented it from turning to chaos, but I don't see any effort having been made. I think they just had their fingers burned in Iraq, and so they just didn't want to get involved. And so there's this odd engagement, but then lack of follow-through. In Syria, Obama didn't want to get involved, then he wanted to bomb the Baathis, now he's bombing the ISIL. I mean, if you follow the pattern through, it's all over the place over time. There's no consistency of policy.
Regrettably, I see we are out of time, so I'm going to have to say thank you very much, Juan Cole. It's another fascinating discussion with you, and we could go on for quite a bit longer. I hope you'll come back to Traverse City sometime.
Thank you very much, Jack.
Thank you. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us on Beyond the Headlines. It's been a great pleasure having you here. Look to our website, tciaf.com, or go to our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to see this and many other broadcasts that we've done in recent past. Thank you so much. Thank you. Great job. Thank you.